Let's take most of this opportunity and get started with Dr. Tara Keenan, a writing instructor and coordinator at John Cabot University Writing Center, Rome, presenting her talk or speech entitled "What If Alto Writers Aren't Behind? Reframing Progress in Composition." Dr. Tara Keenan, thank you for your presence and collaboration. The floor is yours.
Thank you. First, I'd like to start by thanking Rector Megashal, Vice Rector Sharif, Dean Mauro, Department Chair Fried, Director of the Laboratory Adder, our esteemed organizers, Dr. Belker and Dr. Zekri, the University of Clemson, and everyone here. I'd also like to thank Maureen Rooney, who I think this talk will speak a lot to what she was discussing. So I want to begin with a question that many of us in composition have quietly carried for years, but rarely said out loud. What if second language learners aren't behind? What if the entire narrative of catching up is not only inaccurate, but pedagogically limiting? I teach at an international university in Rome, as you know, where half of our students come through the Italian education system and half arrive from the United States or other global contexts. In every classroom, I watch rhetorical traditions collide. Italian textual analysis meets American argumentation. Multilingual repertoires meet monolingual expectations. And yet, despite this richness, the dominant narrative persists. Second language writers need remediation or fixing. But as Paul K. Matsuda reminds us, this assumption is rooted in the myth of linguistic homogeneity, a belief that the default writer is a monolingual native speaker of English. When that is the baseline, multilingual writers will always appear behind. Today, I want to challenge that baseline, and I want to offer a new conceptual frame that I believe can move our field forward. I'll start with a point of reference, Azia Jabbar. I think it makes sense to start with her because she embodied the kind of person I want to talk about, the multilingual writer, with a foot in different worlds, trying to make sense of them all, and somehow building new worlds in the liminal spaces of their shadows. Her example is instructive because she not only talked about writing against erasure, but also lived the tension of writing in a language that was both hers and not hers, a language she transformed through resistance and reinvention. So first I want to discuss the myth of the writer who is behind. The deficit narrative rests on three assumptions that composition scholars have been dismantling for decades. Research in applied linguistics shows that writing is not a ladder, but a network of rhetorical, cultural, and cognitive practices. When we assume writing is linear, we imagine students climbing a staircase. First grammar, then paragraphing, then argumentation, then sophistication. But multilingual writers rarely experience writing this way. Their composing processes are recursive, relational, and contextual. They draw on prior experience that does not map neatly into a single staircase. Atkinson reminds us that writing is always situated in a social activity, shaped by who we're writing for, what we're writing about, and what histories we bring to the page. Lecky's work with multilingual students shows that they often approach writing as problem solving rather than rule following, moving back and forth through various languages, between genres, and rhetorical expectations. So when we treat writing as a hierarchy, with them at the bottom, we misread what multilingual writers are actually doing. They're not out of order. They're composing in a way that reflects the complexity of their linguistic lives. Kanagaraja's work on global Englishes demonstrates that English is not a single target, but a shifting set of practices negotiated across contexts. Yet many classrooms still operate as if there is one correct English that is not only stable, but also universally shared. We also still believe on many levels that language is neutral. But English in Italy is not English in the US, and English in Algeria is not English in Singapore. Students know this intuitively. They move between Englishes depending on audience, purpose, and identity. Kanagaraja argues that communication succeeds not because everyone uses the same English, but because writers and readers negotiate meaning together. This means multilingual writers are not deviating from a standard. They are participating in a global linguistic reality where variation is the norm. When we insist on a single standard to the exclusion of all else, our multilingual students might bring to the table, we flatten this reality. We erase the rhetorical agility students already possess, and we risk teaching a version of English that exists more in textbooks than in the world. Vivian Cook's multi-competence research shows that multilinguals often have more linguistic awareness, not less. The assumption that monolingual writers are somehow whole and multilingual writers are somehow incomplete is one of the persistent myths in composition. Cook challenges this by showing that multilinguals develop a unique cognitive system, one that integrates all their languages rather than keeping them in separate boxes. This integrated system gives multilingual writers heightened sensitivity to form, nuance, and rhetorical effect. They notice patterns monolingual writers overlook. They make deliberate choices about voice, register, and structure because they have experienced language as a set of options, not a single default. So the idea that monolingual writers are the complete ones is not only inaccurate, it reverses the reality. Multilingual writers often have a broader linguistic toolkit and a flexible sense of audience. When we recognize this, we stop asking multilingual writers to catch up and start asking what we can learn from the way they're already thinking about writing. These assumptions are not neutral. They shape assessment, pedagogy, and institutional expectations. The second thing I want to talk about is what multilingual writers actually bring. In my classrooms, they demonstrate the following. Italian-educated students often have explicit grammatical knowledge that monolingual English speakers lack. As Swales and Connor have shown, rhetorical traditions vary widely. Our students bring multiple traditions to the room. Switching languages requires constant monitoring and adaptation, high-level cognitive work. Multilingual writers often have lived experience navigating multiple cultural audiences. They anticipate misunderstanding because they have lived it. These are not deficits. They're rhetorical resources. The third element concerns the limits of fixing students. When we treat multilingual writers as problems to be solved, we narrow their rhetorical range. Lecky warns that remediation often pushes students towards correctness at the expense of rhetorical development. And Ferris notes that overemphasis on error correction, as Maureen Rooney just said, undermines the confidence of undermines their confidence in risk-taking. Matsuda argues that second language writers are too often positioned as outsiders to composition itself. This brings us to the fourth element. A more generative model of progress includes the following. Expansion, not correction. Ophelia Garcia and Lee Wei's translanguaging framework encourages building from students' full linguistic repertoires. But this shift requires us to rethink progress and rethink even what it looks like. Instead of imagining students moving toward a single purified version of English, we begin to see progress as the expansion of rhetorical options. When students draw on their home languages, they're not contaminating English, they're enriching it, stretching its expansive capacity. Translanguaging shows us that multilingual writers already possess sophisticated strategies for meaning making. Our job is not to suppress these strategies, but to help students mobilize intentionally. Progress becomes the ability to choose from a wider range of linguistic resources, not the ability to abandon them. Genre studies show that writing is about choice, not always perfection. When we teach genre, we teach students to see writing as a set of social actions rather than a set of errors to avoid. This reframes progress as the development of rhetorical judgment, knowing when to be formal, knowing when to be direct, knowing when to engage in narrative, when to be analytical. All of these are rhetorical choices. Multilinguals understand that what counts as good writing shifts across cultures, as we said, disciplines and audiences. By foregrounding rhetorical awareness, we validate this expertise and give students a framework for making deliberate, strategic choices. Norton says that language learning is tied to identity, power, investment. When students write, they're not just producing text. They're negotiating who they are allowed to be in an academic space. Progress, then, is not only about mastering conventions. It's about developing a voice that feels authentic and empowered. For multilingual writers, this often means reconciling conflicting expectations. The voice they believe academia commands is what they try to construct. When we acknowledge identity as part of progress, we create classrooms where students can experiment, take risks, and claim ownership in their writing. Ferris emphasizes that confidence is foundational to risk-taking. We often treat confidence as a byproduct of improvement, but for multilingual writers, it's a precondition. Without confidence, students avoid complex structures and ambitious arguments. They write small. When we build confidence through supportive feedback, through modeling vulnerability, through celebrating linguistic diversity, all these things, we unlock the conditions for genuine growth. It's not a soft skill. It's actually a rhetorical resource. Kanagaraja's shuttling describes how multilinguals negotiate meaning across languages. This is not simply code switching. It's a form of rhetorical agility. The ability to move ideas across linguistic and cultural boundaries while maintaining coherence and nuance. When we frame this as leverage rather than interference, we begin to see multilingual writers as innovators. They're already doing the work of negotiating that global communication requires. And the empirical studies back this up. Recent studies demonstrate that second language writers who are encouraged to draw on their multilingual resources show enhanced metacognitive awareness and writing performance. Progress then is not about eliminating this movement. It's about refining it and making it conscious. You might be thinking that I'm advocating for dispensing with grammar and writing standards, but I'm looking more for an inclusive approach. While it's essential to teach English grammar and uphold standards of academic writing, This work cannot stand alone. It must be embedded within a broader framework that values rhetorical diversity and translinguistic engagement. And recent empirical studies provide a significant amount of evidence to suggest that this is the way to go. Grammar instruction gives students tools for clarity and precision, but as scholars such as Garcia and Li Wei argue, linguistic development is most powerful when it draws on the full range of writers' linguistic resources rather than restricting them to a single code. Likewise, genre theorists remind us that correctness is only one dimension of effective writing, but there are others. When grammar is taught as a part of a larger ecology of rhetorical choice, multilingual identity, and flexible language practice, students learn not only how to meet academic expectations, but also how to mobilize their diverse repertoires to produce richer, more intentional writing. What does this look like in practice, though? Our international classrooms, for them, this means naming linguistic diversity as the norm, recognizing the importance of grammar, but also highlighting genre, modeling vulnerability through drafts and revision, designing assignments that invite cultural and rhetorical comparison, giving feedback that builds agency rather than compliance, and celebrating multilingual identity as intellectual capital. These practices shift classroom remediation to innovation. I want a new story for our students. Imagine a classroom where international rhetorical traditions are valued evenly, multilingual writers are not positioned behind, but as rhetorically expansive. Monolingual writers learn from multilingual peers. Writing becomes a site of cross-cultural negotiation. This is not hypothetical. It's already happening in international classrooms if we choose to see it. The key is to move beyond deficit and asset. Even the asset model, celebrating multilingual strengths, still positions multilingual writers in relation to monolingual norms. It still asks what they bring to English rather than how they transform it when they're writing. I want to offer a conceptual frame that I believe can push us forward to a more inclusive conversation about composition. So I propose the concept of rhetorical interlocutorship. A rhetorical interlocutor is someone who navigates multiple rhetorical traditions simultaneously. They negotiate meaning across cultural and linguistic boundaries. They anticipate misalignment and adjust proactively. They read audiences as plural rather than singular. And they understand writing as translation, not transcription. This is not simply translanguaging, though it includes it. It's also not contrastive rhetoric, though it resonates with it. It's not kind of garage's shuttling, though it builds on it. Rhetorical interlocutorship reframes multilingual writers as agents who actively mediate between rhetorical worlds. And here's the key insight. Monolingual writers rarely develop this skill. They don't have to. The rhetorical world is built for them. But multilingual writers do it constantly, with instinct and sophistication. This means multilingual writers are not behind or ahead. They're operating in a different rhetorical dimension. And our international classrooms make this visible. They're not sites of remediation, they're laboratories of rhetorical innovation. So instead of asking, how do we support second language writers, we might ask, what can monolingual writers learn from multilingual rhetorical interlocutors? This flips the hierarchy. It positions multilingual writers as learners of English rhetoric. Okay. but it produces new sets of rhetorical knowledge. This is the contribution I want to offer today. So I return to the question, what if second language writers aren't behind? What if they're somewhere else, an entirely different place? What if our job is not only to correct them, but to accompany them? Not to narrow their voice, but to expand their possibilities? Not to make them sound like native English speakers, but to help them sound like themselves? Our field has the opportunity to rethink what writing is and who gets to define it. If we embrace multilingual writers as rhetorical interlocutors, we don't just change our pedagogy, we change the discipline. And so I want to end where I began with Asia Jabbar. Jabbar once described writing in French as both an exile and a homecoming, a space of constraint and a space of possibility. She wrote not to perfect a language, but to refract it, to bend it towards the memories and rhythms it was never designed to hold. In doing so, she showed us something essential. Multilingual writers do not simply enter a language, they remake it. If we listen closely, our students are doing the same. Our task is not just to notice it, but to let it transform our classrooms. All it takes is a new perspective. Thank you.